I am going to speak in a moment, but I want to let you know how excited I was and thrilled when I was told that some of the descendants of Big Annie would be here tonight. And I believe these two tables here are all descendants of Big Annie. And so I wrote about her in my book and did research on her and read about her. And there's one thing to read about somebody in history who's just a name or a face or a photograph. It is another thing altogether to meet people who actually are family members and descendants of. So I believe that Deborah Devlin would like to step up and say just a few words.
Sure.
Yeah, please do. This is Deborah. I brought mine.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good evening. I would like to start by introducing myself and the family of Annie. My name is Deborah, and my daughter Alexandria, just wave, and her boyfriend Cameron are here with me. My older sister Anne-Marie is here with her husband Mike, daughters Mary-Kate and Anya, and Mary-Kate's boyfriend Mikey. My brother John is here with his wife Denise and sons Aiden and Ryan. We have a sister Jennifer who passed away, and she is here with us in spirit. From the north side of Chicago, we are all south side. Our cousin Michelle is here with her daughters Gia and Natalie. Her sister Allison is here with her daughters Mia and Julia. So we say thank you, and we are so honored to be here. Among us and those family members at home, we are all amazing, strong women and men. Just one, and those two, who have and are continuing to achieve many goals and successes in their professions and educational paths. We are deeply honored to stand before you tonight at this wonderful fundraiser gala for our great and great-great-grandmother Annie. First and foremost, we would like to recognize the committee that has put together this event. Your tireless efforts and unwavering passion has made this evening possible. Thank you for your hard work, creativity, and your dedication. We would also like to extend our heartfelt thanks to each and every one of you for being here. Your presence tonight is a testament to your support, generosity, and commitment to making this statue possible. We are all too young to have known our great and great-grandmother, and our journey in learning about her has been filled with meeting wonderful people who wants us all to know what an important person Annie was and what an immense role and significance she had during the miners' strike. To hear the stories of her perseverance and bravery when standing for what she believed in makes us all proud to be standing here with all of you tonight. In a time, like Veda said, women were not even allowed to express opinions and did not even have the right to vote. Annie stood tall. Her story and legacy is an inspiration for all to fight for what you believe is right. Lastly, again, we would like to thank all of our guests for joining us and believing in the importance of this statue. Thank you again, and keep marching on.
The highlight of my evening is meeting this family. I'm serious. So, who messed this up? There we go. I got it. I got text and you can help me. My name is Steve Lehto. I wrote a book about the Italian Hall disaster. I donated a case of them to the cause, so if you want to get a copy, I'll sign it for you and take care of that. But I'm here to talk about Big Annie. And I wrote about her in my book and did some research on her, but I wrote mainly about the strike, and the Italian Hall disaster itself was the focus of my book. And so I'm not going to talk a lot about those things, but you have to put these things in context. And one of the important things to remember, I am a lawyer, somebody mentioned, but I'm also a historian. And I've had people ask me, what does a historian do? I mean, do you teach? What do you do? Well, the primary thing that historians do is they want to make sure that things are remembered. And it's actually better phrased in the negative, that is, to make sure that things aren't forgotten. And there are things out there that will get forgotten if we don't spend the time to teach others about them, to remember them ourselves, and to respect them the way they need to be remembered. And so I think it's an extremely important thing what they're doing here, because Big Annie really does deserve to be remembered and to not be forgotten. And so the strike of 1913, I'm not going to get too heavily into that because that's not the focus of tonight, but the strike was primarily about recognition of a union, wages, and hours. There's a lot of debate about other things, but if you read the actual letters sent by the union reps to the mine management, they said, we want to talk to you about three things: recognition of the union, better hours, better wages. And there were issues with the working conditions also in the mines. It was very, very deadly back then. For instance, in 1912, 1913, 1 man died per week in the mines. 52 men per year. And by the way, it was men because women weren't allowed to work in the mines. And that's an extremely important thing. So now, the strike of 1913 was an extremely important event in this area. It was also on a national stage. There were reporters from around the country who covered this strike and were here, especially at the beginning of the strike. And many of them returned later after the Italian Hall made headlines, because that made headlines around the world. I've seen the Sydney Morning Herald coverage of it because it was on the papers in Australia. So for those of you who don't know, it was on the front page of the New York Times above the fold on Christmas morning 1913. Extremely important event. So if you start thinking to yourself about who's important and who needs to be remembered, who should not be forgotten, let me ask you about Cripple Creek. You've heard of Cripple Creek? Very, very important event happened there. Can you name for me somebody who's important at that strike? And it becomes a little foggier. I know some people can, Paul, we understand that, but not everybody. We're talking about the general audience. The sit-down strike of Flint. Again, we've heard of it. Very, very important moment in time. Who is the face of that? Don't know. And of course, the Colorado Coalfields or Ludlow. Again, we've heard the name. Do we know the faces that go with that? And so if you think about the strike of 1913, and I was at the site, make sure I'm pointing in the right direction. I was at the site yesterday, walking around as I do every time I come to visit town, and I was looking at the big placard out front by the National Park Service that tells the story, and there's a couple faces there. Big Annie's is the largest face on that placard, and that's for a reason. Who else was involved in the strike? Well, Charles Moyer was the head of the union, but he wasn't really on the ground leading the strikers. He wasn't out there marching. He might show up for a photo opportunity, send out some telegrams from time to time, but he was not the face of the strike. Of course, Jim McNaughton ran Calumet and Hecla. I believe he spent most of his time at the window, writing letters back to Boston in code describing what was happening here. But again, he was not the person you remember from the strike. Big Annie is who you remember from the strike. And that's for a good reason, because of what she did. And so keep in mind that she was leading the strikers almost from day one. And yet she wasn't a striker because she wasn't a worker. And the idea that you're going to go out and lead other people in a strike, and you're not one of the strikers. She's married to a striker, but that's not the same thing. And as other people pointed out, in 1913, a woman's place, forgive me, was in the home. And she went out in the streets carrying a gigantic flagpole, the gigantic American flag, at the head of all these processions. And so there's a few things going on here I think we need to talk about. First of all, she wasn't just active in union activities. She was also a member of the Slovenian Women's Lodge. She was a member of the Women's Local, which is the auxiliary for the union. And she got elected president of these things. She wasn't just a joiner, she was a leader. She would join an organization, and sure enough, people would go, we want you in charge. We want you to handle this. So people around her recognized her leadership abilities. But I like to point out, and they have a great illustration in the lobby as you walk in, which is a life-size portrait of Big Annie. Big Annie was 6'2". Some sources say 6'4", but let's go with 6'2". I am 6'1.5", and I'm gonna be honest, I tell people 6'2", but I'm 6'1.5". So if I was standing right here back to back with Big Annie, she'd have a ½ inch on me. So she's not somebody who disappears into a crowd, especially when she's carrying a 10-foot flagpole with a gigantic American flag. She's out there leading these parades, leading these pickets, and these things weren't as peaceful as we might think of them today. So for instance, she was arrested several times. The autograph on the commemorative tumblers is her signature when she was signing out some paperwork at the Houghton County Jail, and that's because she was arrested several times. And if you find out what she was arrested for, it's usually something trumped up like disturbing the peace, making noise, causing a confrontation, walking in the street, jaywalking, whatever. And they would often find things to charge her with. But the interesting thing is there are people out there. If you arrest them once and teach them a lesson, they go away. Big Annie came back for more. And that is something that is so admirable. As an attorney, I can tell you that there are people out there who would say, you know, as a matter of principle, I'd go to jail on this. A lot of people change their mind when they spend one night in jail. And she went to jail several times. And she wrote about her experiences and told people about it, but she's right back out as soon as she got out of jail. Where's my flagpole? Let's go march. And so it's extremely important to understand what kind of person it would take to do that. But also understand that in 1913, there were absolutely no laws to protect unions or workers in this type of a setting. So if you joined a union, they could fire you. If you went on strike, they could say, great, don't come back, we don't care. And so there were federal laws that came in later, like the National Labor Relations Act, to protect unions and workers, but none of them existed in 1913. So every single one of the strikers who voted to go on strike, and by the way, it was almost, not quite unanimous, but a very, very large majority of the workforce voted to strike, okay? So they voted to strike knowing that they could all get fired, they might never get their jobs back, but they did it anyway because, again, they're fighting for recognition, wages, hours, and safer working conditions. And so she's out there leading the parades, she's doing something, there's no laws protecting her. And one of the pictures that pops up as they scroll through over here on the TV screen is, I think, the best example of what you can talk about the spirit of Big Annie. The National Guard was called in to Calumet. The mine management made it sound like there was rioting in the streets when there really wasn't any. And the National Guard showed up, and they were marching around, they camped in town. And at one point in time, there was a large parade being led by Big Annie with her big old flag, and there's some other people with her, Ben Goggin from the Union and so on. And they encountered a bunch of guardsmen coming towards them, and two immovable forces stop in the middle of the street, broad daylight, a lot of witnesses to this, including sworn testimony, so we know what happened. And Big Annie had her big flag with her, and the National Guardsman said, you guys have got to leave and go home. And she said, I don't have to leave, this is America, I'm just as right to be here as you are. And the guy has a saber, he's on horseback, he's got a saber. And he shakes the saber at her and says, I'm telling you, you need to leave. And she says, I'm paraphrasing, but she says something to the effect of, run me through with your sword, but if this American flag can't protect me, nothing can. And the guy actually whacked at her with the sword. And she dropped the flag because she got her fingers cut. And you'll see in the photograph that pops up over here, she's got a bandage on her hand. Now, she's no worse for the wear. She picked the flag up and continued going. But they actually had an investigation by the National Guard to find out what happened that day where that woman threw the flag on the ground. And that's how they spun that. And so we have the photograph that shows that that event actually did happen. It was in the papers, there were witnesses to it, and that was her. And the one thing I really want to point out, this is important, is that Big Annie was born in Calumet. Now that's not a surprise to most of us. We go, of course she was. But if you read the newspaper coverage and all the internal documents and memoranda and the things that were going around at that time, they were always painting the strikers as outsiders and foreigners. And one of the reasons she's carrying a big old American flag is because she's an American citizen. She was born here. And just for those of you following along at home, Jim McNaught was born in Canada. But we like our Canadian neighbors also. However, she's an American. And that was one of the things that she had at the forefront of her mind is, this is America. I have a right to participate just as much as anybody else here. And so my last name is Lehto. I'm mispronouncing it. There's Finns in the audience, you know that, and I apologize. I can't say it right because I don't speak Finnish. But my ancestors had very heavy accents. And so if I keep my mouth shut, you go look at the guy, he's a white guy. But when my ancestors started talking, they sounded like foreigners because they're speaking Finnish. And so there was this weird division back then that we don't quite have the same today in this sense. But these people were all being painted as outsiders, agitators, almost like foreigners, but they were Americans. And so the focus of my book is the Italian Hall disaster. 73 people died, 60 of them were children, over half of them were Finnish. Most of them were American citizens. And the weird part is there is so much stuff that got published after that where they're saying, well, it was these outside agitators, these foreigners and outsiders, blah, 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 blah. Most of the kids were born in the local hospital. They were American citizens. And so that's one of the things that I think needs to be pointed out here is that there was a lot of prejudice against her, not just because she's leading strikes, not just because she was a woman, but also she was viewed as an outside agitator, despite the fact she was born an American citizen. And so that, to me, is one of the things that we really have to remember. So when she's leading a strike parade and there's people following her who are striking workers, she's Slovenian of Slovenian descent. She's an American citizen of Slovenian descent. There were Croatians, Hungarians, Italians, Finns, all these different groups that were all joining together and following her. And that is also how good of a leader she was. And I really think that's something we need to really focus on. So one of the things that's always kind of upset me about the strike of 1913 is how many people will talk about it and go, well, the strike ended in April of 1914, they voted to go back to work, they tore up their union cards, and the unions made no inroads for decades. And I've had people tell me that, well, they lost. They lost. And actually, it's a great example of where somebody lost the battle, but they won the war. Because I mentioned the sit-down strike, which happened about 20 or 30 years later, right? The National Guard got called into that. And the governor actually sent them in and said, you guys are not taking sides. Go in there and make sure that try to quell the violence, but no taking sides. And up till that point, they've been taking sides. They took sides here. And so people did learn a lesson from what happened here, okay? And so it may have been fits and starts, it may have taken a while, but then later on there were also things like federal laws protecting unions. Now you can't fire somebody because they've joined a union. You can't fire somebody because they're trying to organize a union. It still happens, but there's laws that will protect you there. Those laws didn't come about in a vacuum. They came about because of the struggles like this, where people went out and against horrible odds did things like get arrested 5 or 6 times and get slashed at by a National Guardsman with his sword and, be figuratively beaten up in the news as a foreigner, outside agitator, and so on. And she was doing all those things, and it's an interesting thing to study where heroes come from. Because quite often, you look at somebody and go, they came along at the perfect moment. If that person had come along 10 years later, they might not have had the opportunity to do this. 10 years earlier, who knows what she'd be doing. But at that moment in time, she stepped up and she goes, someone needs to do this, it's going to be me. And so she stepped up and she did it. So I think it's extremely important that we remember her. We do not forget her. And how do you remember somebody? you know. She's in the Hall of Fame, Women's Hall of Fame in Lansing. We know that. I've never been there. I'm not even sure where it is, other than Lansing. There used to be a small plastic sign out at the side of the Italian Hall. It's gone now. I'm not really sure if you know where it went, but it's gone. But it was a small plastic sign, and it's better than nothing, but it's not enough. So what we really do need is a statue to Big Annie. And we were talking a little bit before, while we're eating dinner, there's one statue in town that I can think of, and it's Alexander Agassiz sitting out there about 100 yards from the float copper as you drive into town. And ask most people, what did he do? Like, oh. But ask people, what did Big Annie do? And enough people know what she did, and there's a reason they know it more than 100 years later. And so I'm a huge fan. Again, thank you for coming. It's a great honor to meet you, descendants of Annie. But understand that she was the perfect person to fill that void at the time she came along. And she did such a great job of it. As you watch the videos go by, watch how many of these photos she's leading the strikers in. And understand that when one comes by and she's not in the picture, your first thought is, where's Annie? Is this Callie Annette? Where is she? And that's the natural instinct you have. And I should also mention, I think I glossed over this, when she was leading parades, she didn't just lead parades, she also led the funeral processions. And so the Italian Hall disaster took place, and there was one day of many funerals held simultaneously, and the Pine Street Apostolic Lutheran Church, for instance, had a bunch of people there, and so did a couple other churches, and they all let out. They had this huge procession out to the Lakeview Cemetery. And Big Annie's out front with her flagpole, but now it's draped in black. And interestingly, that was not the first parade that she led that year to the cemetery. She also led the parade for the strikers in Seaborville who were killed by mine guards. And the Seaborville killings were in August, I believe it was, in the funeral, and she led that one also. And so she wasn't just there, I'm going to do the easy work. She's like, I'm here for everything. I'm here for everything. And I think that everyone knew that. And so I think that's one of the reasons that we've got to remember her, because how important she was. So I am going to suggest that a statue is a perfectly fitting thing that we need to do for her. Everything we can do to raise money for that purpose, I'm in favor of. And I brought my drink with me. And I would ask that if you can find something to hold up in the air, whether it's a drink or not, we need to toast Big Annie in her memory and do everything we can to make sure she's not forgotten. Yes. Thank you.